Okay. So today, terrorism and globalization. And we're supposed to be doing this for your listening role, most of you. Has everybody brought their copy of the PowerPoints for this thing? Chapter 22 from the book on terrorism and how globalization helps or hinders terrorists. So first of all, a definition of terrorism. The use of violence by sub-state groups to inspire fear by attacking civilians and or symbolic targets for purposes such as drawing widespread attention to a grievance, provoking a severe response, or wearing down their opponent's resolve to affect political change. So the things that are in this definition, because actually defining terrorism isn't that easy. There are various definitions to it, but almost all the definition will include the following elements: that it involves fear, terror, and that's where the name comes from. And it's about affecting political change. So terrorism is done for political ends. In some cases, I guess now with Al-Qaeda, you might claim that ultimately their end is religious rather than political, but groups like Al-Qaeda and some of the other Islamic terrorists, what they're often looking for is to have Sharia law implemented in the country they're in, and that ultimately is a political change, even if it's done for religious reasons. Violence, of course, is part of terrorism, whichever definition you would want to give to it. And this definition says sub-state groups. So this definition excludes the possibility that states can take part in terrorism. Some would argue that you do get state-sponsored terrorism. So, what do you think is meant by symbolic targets? Yeah, so the World Trade Center, Osama bin Laden tried, before Al-Qaeda flew those aircraft into the World Trade Center, Osama bin Laden had been behind another plot that had attempted to blow up the World Trade Center with a car bomb in the basement. And bin Laden saw the World Trade Center as a symbol of America. So very often, terrorism will target these often buildings that somehow represent what they're against. In Dublin, they used to have, it's called Nelson's Pillar. There's Nelson's Column in London, there's Nelson's Pillar in Dublin. It's on O'Connell Street outside the main post office. And Nelson, of course, was a British sailor and British admiral. And the presence of Nelson's Pillar was seen by Irish nationalists as representing the 800 years of oppression, the 800 years in which Ireland was ruled by Britain. And so the IRA blew up Nelson's Pillar in 1966. They damaged it enough that it had to be taken down. So that was an attack on a target that was seen as a symbol of British rule in Ireland. And it's actually just 50 years after Ireland had become independent, and they still didn't want that symbol of British rule to be there on the main street. Okay, I have actually changed the presentation today, so because the map that I had in there stopped at 2008, and I haven't been able to find more up-to-date maps, so I added a few more things. This is a graph that shows us the total fatalities in terror attacks worldwide. What are fatalities? So, in the 1970s, very few deaths from terrorism, big surge in the early 1980s, and then, I suppose this is finally a chance you could use the word fluctuate in describing your graphs as one. It's been more or less level, somewhere around about 10,000 deaths a year, some years a few more, some years a few less. There's 2001, and the attacks on the World Trade Center, and this big rise in recent years, up to 2012. This is countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. And here, a different map. This shows us terror attacks from 2002 to 2011. So the red dots show you where they are. This actually comes from the Economist. Actually, I got it from somebody's blog who got it from the Economist, who take the information from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And they've come up with an index that rates a terrorism index. You see Iraq's at the top at with a risk of 9.56 out of 10. Pakistan, Afghanistan. Even some countries that you might perhaps be somewhat surprised by, Russia is on here as well. That's because of the Chechens, Chechnya, and the other stuff in the Caucasus. So these are the big ones. There's Afghanistan, there's Iraq in here, Israel. What's this one over here? Where is this for the terrorist attacks? That's Colombia, yeah. It's unfortunate I couldn't find an up-to-date map like the one that's actually in those PowerPoints, because when I have this, usually I ask you to, I put you in groups and ask you to identify the countries on the map that have most terrorist attacks. Philippines, another one. Japan, nothing in there at all for this period. Britain does have terrorist problems. That's at one stage it was the IRA. It was related to Irish terrorism. There's still some of that in Northern Ireland, but recent terrorism in Britain has been linked more to Al Qaeda, and not necessarily Al Qaeda itself, but the general Islamic Jihad cause. And you can see here another measure of this is terrorist incidents rather than deaths, the other thing. Again, it's risen quite noticeably from 2002, from just around about 1,000 attacks a year up to 4,500 in here. And Iraq, a big contributor to terrorism around the number of terrorist incidents in the world. Now, one of the things about terrorism is that it's very, very unusual for anybody or any organization to describe themselves as a terrorist organization. And the reason is at the bottom, that terrorist has a pejorative meaning. It's got a negative meaning to it, and in fact, labeling somebody as a terrorist is part of the political handling of whatever the problem is. So in Syria, for example, even before Syria descended into civil war, when the protests in Syria were still peaceful, Assad was already calling his opponents armed terrorist gangs. And that's immediately to put a label on them and say, they're bad, we're good, and they're bad, they are terrorists. And at the beginning, they certainly weren't terrorists because they weren't using violence and they weren't attacking people, but the situation now changed more like a civil war than terrorism. So, we're saying here, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Towards the end of the British and the French empires, the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of the countries, well, the now countries that were then colonies, had people fighting for their independence and committing acts of violence. So, again, the colonial authorities would label them as terrorists. The people doing this themselves would call themselves freedom fighters. They were fighting for the freedom for their country. So, other names that show up in terms that people are more likely to use for themselves to describe themselves: separatists. Well, Crimea is, as Russia now says, Crimea is part of Russia. That was done actually without terrorism, which is good. But separatists are generally people, they're groups of people whose aim is to separate their piece of land from the original country. So Scotland has its, well, they wouldn't call themselves separatists, they're nationalists. Because Scotland is looking to secede from the United Kingdom. So this is quite common, that areas of a country want to separate and become their own state. Freedom fighters, again, this is a name that implies that there's something wrong with the government. We're fighting for our freedom. Liberators, again, it's used in circumstances when you're claiming that the government is somehow illegitimate or it's a colonialist government. Revolutionaries, generally associated with left-wing terrorists, looking to establish usually a socialist state. And all the other names, you've got these ones, the last ones, jihadi, mujahideen and fedayeen, these have all come from the Middle East and finally origin from Arabic. I would say terrorism is a word that has a negative meaning, a pejorative meaning. Now, this is one way of classifying terrorists into 4 different types of terrorists based on what it is they're trying to achieve. You've got left-wing terrorists, and this was probably a large part of terrorism in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. The objective of most left-wing terrorists was to depose the government and set up a socialist state. Socialist in the sense that is used by communists. Most communists talk about achieving a socialist state rather than achieving a communist state. So these were often supported by the Soviet Union, and it was generally not just the overthrow of the government, but the replacement of that government by a state run along communist lines, socialist lines. You can also get right-wing terrorists associated with fascism, and here they're looking to impose usually a more autocratic system. Sometimes in some countries we've got both left-wing and right-wing terrorists. Colombia is actually an example of that, where the major terrorist force, the FARC, is a left-wing group, but they've been fighting their revolution for 50 years or something, and it's funded through, well, essentially by taxing people in occupied areas and through the drug trade. And so people who then object to that set up their own right-wing system. They're called the paramilitaries in Colombia. Sometimes you do get terrorists who support a right-wing government and are essentially fighting against left-wing elements as well. And then we've got ethno-nationalists, which is, well, there's the nationalist bit, they want their own country. The ethno part is they're usually based on an ethnic group. So again, the situation in Crimea that's been keeping watching closely. Crimea hasn't been an example of terrorism, but what you did have, what the groups you've had in Crimea have been ethno-nationalist. It's basically the Russians or the Russian-speaking people who wanted to break away from Ukraine and in this case rejoin or become a part of Russia. So they were ethno-nationalists, the Russians in Crimea, but not terrorists. And these are often the same thing as separatists. In other words, they're fighting for their own homeland. The Basque terrorists, the Basques in northern Spain and southern France, ETA is their organization. They were a terrorist group. They'd be described as ethno-nationalists, as separatists. And increasingly, we've seen in recent years the rise of religious or sacred terrorism. And this is Al-Qaeda, but you can have, there are other examples. I mean, there have been Hindu nationalists who've used terror in India. It's not just an Islamic phenomenon, you can have fundamental Christians doing this as well. But here their principal motivation is religious, even though in the end they really are still trying to achieve political change. So with Al-Qaeda, it's primarily Muslims against the West. Bin Laden started out because he wanted to get American soldiers out of Saudi Arabia. But ultimately, it isn't just about getting Christians out of Muslim lands. It's about trying to impose Sharia law, which is basically the Quran, the holy book of Islam, tells you how to live your life, and that's what should be used as the basis for law. But there's also now acts of terrorism between different Muslim groups themselves. There are two main strands to Islam. There's the Sunni and the Shia branches. They're both Muslims. They both believe in the Quran. The division goes back to quite soon after the time of Muhammad. It's about successors to Muhammad. And then we now see terrorist attacks by one of those groups on the other one, the Shias against the Sunnis. Al-Qaeda is principally a Sunni Islam group. Okay, for your listening logs, that's it. That's 20 minutes already. So, if you are a terrorist, how much terror should you be using? How many people should you be killing in order to achieve your ends? How many terrorist attacks should you launch every day or every week or whatever? And the thing is that what terrorists are trying to do is, by creating terror, they want to achieve their ends. And that is about trying to get the broader population to accept the ends that they're looking for. And if I want to impose, if I decide we want to have Sharia law, one of the things I'm going to do is convince people, the population in general, that they should support that. If you're a terrorist group and you don't carry out enough terrorist activities, people forget about you and you just fade away, and that's no good. So too little and you're just irrelevant. You're neither getting people on your side, nor are you wearing down the government as well. Because to achieve change, you've got to have the people on your side, and you've got to somehow essentially get the government to just give up at some point. If you're not going to achieve an armed uprising, maybe you just get the president to run away. I mean, it does sometimes happen. On the other hand, if you use too much violence, too many attacks kill too many people, there's the risk that you're going to lose support from the population. And potentially you might create too much violence, and you'll see the creation of groups opposed to you. And that was part of what happened in Iraq. When the Americans were still in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda was busy in parts of Iraq. They did manage to get the Sunni people to create their own anti-Al-Qaeda groups. They didn't want Al-Qaeda running things. That was called the Awakening. And eventually that was enough to allow the Americans to essentially get control of the situation over Al-Qaeda. So too much violence is not a good idea either. It can turn people against you. Sometimes what terrorists are trying to do as well is they're hoping that they can provoke the government into reacting too strongly. So when governments face threats from terrorism, there always seems to be a temptation for the government itself to break the law, round people up, arrest loads of people, resort to torture to get the answers. And so sometimes what the terrorists are actually trying to do is to get the government to do that, so that the government itself alienates itself from the population by dealing too harshly or too severely with the population. If the government starts locking everybody up, then that's likely to help the terrorists, because now you've turned people against the government, and so sometimes that's what you're trying to do. By attacking the government, you're trying to provoke the government into the kind of response that will be unpopular. So let's have a look at some of the prominent terrorist groups around the world. Terrorists, I've put this in inverted commas because none of these organizations will describe themselves as terrorists. You'll sometimes see, we've seen interviews with people who've been labeled as terrorists, and they say, let me be quite clear, we are not a terrorist group. Yes, we commit acts of violence, but this is legitimate political violence, is their argument. So the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, it's still around. It's no longer, the official part of the IRA is no longer involved in terrorism, but the IRA constantly splits off, and there are still people who are prepared to fight for a united Ireland. It's on the map there. The Republic of Ireland is in orange, and Northern Ireland is in purple. Up until 1922, the whole of Ireland was ruled by Britain. So the whole of that was just the United Kingdom. And the original IRA eventually forced Britain to negotiate and hand over what's now the Republic of Ireland to an independent government, but they kept the 6 counties of Northern Ireland because there's a unionist majority there. So from 1922 onwards, and still to today, there are people who want a united Ireland. They want Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic. And the main part of the IRA is they are now part of the political process, the Good Friday Agreement in 1997. The political wing of the IRA is called Sinn Féin. They have MPs both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. But there are still armed groups that have split off from the main part of the Irish Republican Army and are still prepared to follow the armed struggle in order to incorporate Northern Ireland into the Republic. So, up until this agreement, the objective of the Irish Republican Army was primarily the expulsion of Britain from Northern Ireland. There was actually more to it than that. These were originally a left-wing organisation, so this wasn't all that they wanted. Not only did they want to get Britain out of Northern Ireland, they also wanted to overthrow the Irish government in Dublin and replace it with a socialist government as well. So this is the main driving force, ethno-nationalism. But underlying this was also the left-wing political view of it. The IRA, at one time, was being funded by Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi would fund anybody that was sort of anti-American or anti-Western at one time. They would ship ships full of weapons to Ireland. And Irish Americans were big supporters of the IRA as well. So they joined the political process in 1997, so the IRA is now Sinn Féin is what they call themselves as a political party. They're now a respected part of the political spectrum on both sides of the border in Ireland. Now, this is one of these strange things about the English language. This is always pronounced as IRA, so you read out the 3 letters in the name. It'd be perfectly easy to pronounce this as a word. But this in English is always pronounced ETA. So it's pronounced like a word, not ETA. This is what it stands for, which I'm sure you will read. This is in the Basque language. So ETA, we're looking to establish again, left-wingers, a socialist Basque state in northern Spain and southwest France. So the Basques are an ethnic group. They have their own language, which isn't related to, not very related at all to Spanish. Quite a different language. Now, again, I've changed this from your PowerPoint. ETA in 2012 declared a permanent unilateral ceasefire. Unilateral meaning? So it's always one something, one-sided. So this is basically, ETA said, we are declaring a ceasefire. It wasn't a negotiated one. The Spanish state didn't declare a ceasefire. The Spanish state still won't deal with the Basques, by the way. Now, the thing is that the Basques, ETA have declared ceasefires in the past, and they've broken them after a few years. They say, okay, we're permanent ceasefire, and a couple of years later they set off a bomb in Madrid airport or something. So it's hard to tell whether this really will be permanent or not. ETA have killed about 800 people in their terrorist campaign. Not the IRA, but in Northern Ireland in total, both deaths from terrorism by the IRA, the principal Republican group. There are also unionist terror groups, and the army, British Army was there. And about 3,000 people were killed in what's called the Troubles from the 1960s until late 1990s. I've already mentioned them, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. They're always known as, these are the initials from the Spanish form of their name. This is one of the world's longest running guerrilla wars. Actually, FARC are FARC, I think, are quite different from your typical terrorist group, in that FARC are actually organized like an army. And they occupy land, they occupy quite a large part of the land in Colombia. Again, this is a left-wing grouping, and they're looking to overthrow the Colombian government and again to set up a socialist state in Colombia. They finance themselves primarily through the drug trade. Colombia is one of the big producers of coca leaves, which it's used for cocaine, and all groups have got to finance themselves somehow, and often if they can, they do it through drug trade, or through robberies as well. Now, there are at the moment talks going on between the Colombian government and FARC. The current president of Colombia is willing to talk to FARC to see if they can settle this. The previous president was very much against that, and although he chose his successor, he's now fallen out with him over this issue of negotiating with terrorists. One of the first terrorist organizations that came to attention was the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Their original objective was the elimination, the destruction of the state of Israel. That Israel should disappear from the map and you'd have a Palestinian state in its place. They've now modified their views. They now accept the existence of Israel, and what they want is an independent Palestine. So they do actually run the West Bank, which will be a large part of their Palestinian state, but the West Bank essentially remains under Israeli occupation. It's divided into different parts of it, but Israel retains control over security in the West Bank. So although the Palestinians have some kind of government, they're still not an independent state. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization were involved in hijacking planes in the 1960s. You hijack planes and fly them off somewhere, and then use that as a publicity ploy. They typically didn't kill that many people. Some people were killed. The Israeli athletes who were killed in the Munich Olympic Games, it was the PLO that were involved in that. Oh, Al-Qaeda, the big one at the moment. Now, Al-Qaeda is often described as being rather like a franchise. That it's not one big organization. It's you get terrorist groups in different countries who declare themselves to be aligned with Al-Qaeda, but basically take the name. So you've got groups in Indonesia who say they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda, across the Middle East and even through into Algeria. You've got Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So, what does Al-Qaeda want? They want to remove foreign influence from Islamic countries, in particular Christian influence from Islamic countries. So bin Laden was a Saudi, and Saudi Arabia has Islam's two holiest places, Mecca and Medina. Actually, if you're a non-Muslim, you can't even go to Mecca. They won't let you into the city. But originally, as I say, bin Laden wanted to get American soldiers out of Saudi Arabia, sort of saw it as unclean people, the infidels treading on the holy soil of Saudi Arabia. The goal of, one of the goals of Al-Qaeda is to establish a single Islamic empire to establish a caliphate. Now, a caliphate is a country run by a caliph. It's just a name for a leader. In the early days of Islam, you did have caliphs who ran things. So they want to establish one big Islamic country that takes in all of the lands that include Islam, that include Muslims. So you go all the way across North Africa, the Middle East. They probably want India as well, Indonesia, and even parts of the Philippines where they've got Muslims. One of the relatively new things that Al-Qaeda has done is to use lots of suicide bombings. They're not the first group to use suicide bombings. The Tamil Tigers use them quite a lot. But the sort of the hallmark of a lot of the Muslim terrorists is the use of suicide bombings. People pack a car full of explosives, drive it to where they want and set it off and kill themselves. And this works because of the religious nature of the group, the idea being that the people who do this and kill themselves in these attacks do it because they believe that what they're doing is right, and in carrying out this act they will go to heaven. So that's how you get people to do it. I say it isn't really a single command structure, it's very much a network of affiliates. So the groups don't coordinate themselves. There's no Al-Qaeda headquarters. Even before bin Laden was killed, he wasn't really in charge of Al-Qaeda. He could send out messages, but the guys in Iraq were doing whatever they wanted to do, and the guys in Algeria as well. Okay, so what then are some of the explanations for militant Islam? Because it's a relatively new phenomenon. Well, there are cultural explanations that say that it's really driven by a desire to preserve identity, traditions, and values. And for many of the Islamic terrorists, this desire to have their country run by Sharia law, like the law is laid down in the Quran. And actually even more than that, it's about saying we should be living the same way as Muhammad lived in the 7th century. That's what many of them want. It's saying the Quran, we should live like the Prophet lived. So we should turn the clock back to the 7th century and live like that. So it is about identity, traditions, and values. The economic explanations of militant Islam is it's seen as a reaction to economic imperialism, where products from the developed world are sent to Islamic countries, where companies dominate the economy. Companies from non-Islamic countries, so the West, dominate the economies of Islamic countries as well. So again, it's about rejecting the intrusion of the West on Islamic countries. Another explanation is that part of militant Islam is a reaction to the failure of Islamic states to develop. Many Islamic states should be quite wealthy because they've got oil. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And yet, whilst they're rich in that sense, they're not particularly well developed, and they fail to provide jobs for people as well. So you've got people feeling unhappy with the governments that they've got, and they'd like to change it. Now, why you want to sort of go back to far more basic things isn't clear to me. And increasingly, the population of many of these Islamic countries are becoming better educated, and that better education and actually better connection with the world makes people realize just how badly off they are in their own country. And so that stimulates a desire to do something different, and it's connected to this. Not only are we poor, but we know that we're poor. If you don't know you're poor, it's not a big problem. That's just the way life is. And again, globalization has led to this greater awareness. People know what's happening in other countries, and they realize their government is failing them. The religious explanations a lot is made of the distinction between the faithful, Muslims, and the infidels, who are not the non-Muslims, and that Islam, like Christianity as well, in fact, Islam encourages people to convert others to their religion. Something like you're allowed to kill people if they won't convert to your religion. There's something like that in the Quran. And actually for Muslims, one of the worst things, it's not the infidels, the people who don't believe, it's the apostates. These are people who, an apostate is somebody who's given up their religion. And for Muslims, that's about the worst thing that you can do. In fact, in many Muslim countries, renouncing your religion, if you're a Muslim, is a capital offense. You can be put to death for trying to stop being a Muslim, which is just not allowed. And so many of the people involved in groups, in these Islamic groups, it's about a war. It is really a war between religions. And the Quran contains the concept of jihad, meaning struggle. Now there are arguments about just how that should be interpreted, whether it's a sort of more a spiritual struggle rather than a physical sort of battle-like struggle. But the Quran does involve this idea of fighting for your religion. One thing about Islam is that there's no equivalent of, say, the Pope in Islam. So the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church who kind of interprets policy, if you like. Islam doesn't have that, and each individual preacher can make their own decisions, and you get groups within Islam, and they refuse to believe that another group are Muslims at all. If you don't do it like I do it, you're not even a Muslim. Whereas the outside world would say, yeah, they're Muslims, and they're Muslims, and they're Muslims. Within the community itself, it's say Sunni and Shia, the Sunni don't believe that the Shia are real Muslims. One of the complications. Okay, so how then does globalization help with terrorism, or hinder terrorism? Well, first thing that globalization does is it allows for proselytizing. This is preaching. This is, if you like, advertising your cause is what this is. I'm telling people about your cause. So the internet is very good for that, and you can find all kinds of websites promoting Al-Qaeda's ideas. And not just Al-Qaeda, I mean any organization can now get their message out and make it available. Right? So that's helpful if you're a terrorist, or if you're an anti-establishment group, you can get your message out. And it's not really known how many people have been converted to the way of Al-Qaeda through what they've read on the internet, but people do it. The Boston Marathon bombings, the pressure cooker bombs. Those guys found out how to make those bombs on the internet as well. Globalization, with its increased abilities for communication, makes coordination so much easier. So the September the 11th attackers, who were almost all Saudis, they were flying around the world. They were in Germany, they were in the United States, all over the place. So you can coordinate, you can actually meet physically, but you can also, with email, with Skype, all the communication tools that we have, make it easy for people to coordinate terrorist attacks. If you know how to do it, the internet can actually provide you with very secure means of communication. You can encrypt your emails, for example. Make it very difficult to break in. Communication doesn't always work in favor of the terrorists. If you use secure enough means, you can, but things like satellite phones, which are very useful things to have if you're in the wilds of Afghanistan or something. You don't need a mobile phone coverage. But governments can track satellite phones. In the end, Osama bin Laden, when he was in Pakistan, he wasn't using satellite phones. I don't think he even had an internet connection. He used people to carry his messages, put them on a USB stick, take this somewhere and give it to somebody. So, the latest, the Edward Snowden revelations about all the information that the American government picks up in terms of emails and phone calls, all of that actually helps governments, and that's part of the thing that makes globalization helps governments too. So you can use the internet to get good security. Globalization, the mobility, the fact that you can move around and recruit people works in favor of terrorists. You can also use airplanes as part of your terror campaign. I mean, the idea of flying the aircraft into the World Trade Center was a new one, but targeting aircraft is like a traditional terrorist way of doing things, blow aircraft up. We've had things like the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber. So planes make nice targets for terrorists. And globalization potentially increases the ability or the lethality of things, that information on how to develop better weapons, better bombs, is easily spread through the internet as well. Okay, are there any questions? Well, you can make much more lethal bombs, things that are more effective at killing people. Because all that information is available on the internet, you want to produce, fancy releasing poison on the Tokyo Metro again. Again, the internet allows you to find out how to create your own, I don't know if you can make nerve gas yourself, but the information to be able to kill more people is available, is the point of that. Yeah, suppose it's very difficult for terrorists, for example, to build, get their hands on a nuclear weapon. Well, they might manage to steal one, but the bigger worry is if a group of terrorists can get their hands on a relatively large quantity of radioactive material, not to make a nuclear weapon, but to make a dirty bomb. In other words, you pack the radioactive material with an ordinary bomb and you set it off, and the explosion will scatter the radioactive material around and contaminate large areas. And so you could ask the question, no, if I had somebody sold me 25 kilos of radioactive material, how could I build a dirty bomb, an efficient dirty bomb? And I'm pretty sure you go and look on the internet, you'll find that kind of information. So the internet makes information available to everybody, and in this case, it lets you build more effective weapons, kill more people. Other questions? Okay, break time, and then we're in the computer room to do some SPSS.